When Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE, the world he had conquered was left without a clear heir. His empire stretched from Greece to India, and yet, in the moment of his death, there was no obvious successor strong enough to hold it together. Alexander's sudden passing was the spark that lit one of the most brutal and chaotic conflicts of the ancient world, the Wars of the Diadochi. These wars are rarely given the spotlight in classrooms or documentaries, yet they were as decisive and bloody as any of the campaigns Alexander himself had waged. They determined the fate of the ancient Mediterranean, reshaped borders, and birthed dynasties that would dominate for centuries. And yet, when people think of Alexander, they often imagine his victories and charisma, not the blood-soaked struggles that followed in his absence. The central problem was succession. Alexander left behind only an unborn son and a half-brother with severe learning difficulties. This meant that the throne of the most powerful empire on earth was effectively vacant, and his most trusted generals, men who had marched with him for years, who had faced Persian kings and Indian war elephants at his side, were suddenly rivals. These generals are remembered as the Diadochi, meaning successors. Each of them believed they had the right to inherit part of Alexander's vast legacy, but none trusted the others. The result was decades of endless shifting alliances, betrayals, and wars that consumed the empire Alexander had built. At first, there was an attempt at compromise. The generals proclaimed Alexander's half-brother, Philip III Aridaeus, as king, along with Alexander's unborn son, Alexander IV, once he was born. But of course, neither child could rule, so the real power rested in the hands of the generals. Almost immediately, suspicion and ambition tore them apart. Perdiccas, who was named regent, tried to enforce unity, but others resisted his authority. Antipater, the long-serving governor of Macedon, distrusted him. Ptolemy, the general who would eventually found the Egyptian dynasty of the Ptolemies, seized Alexander's body and brought it to Egypt, defying Perdiccas and turning what should have been a sacred funeral procession into a political weapon. The very corpse of Alexander became a prize worth fighting over. The wars that followed were not glorious campaigns of conquest like Alexander's. They were wars of attrition, sieges, and massacres. Cities that had once welcomed Alexander as a liberator now found themselves burnt to the ground in the wars of his successors. Armies marched back and forth across Asia Minor, Syria, and Mesopotamia. Mercenaries switched sides constantly, selling their swords to whichever general paid more. Battles raged not just between armies but inside royal courts, as women of Alexander's family became pawns in the bloody game of power. Alexander's own mother, Olympias, was murdered in this struggle. His widow, Roxana, and his young son were also killed, eliminated so they could not become rallying figures for one faction or another. In this way, the bloodline of Alexander was extinguished within a generation of his death. The brutality was staggering. At the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE, one of the largest and most decisive of these conflicts, tens of thousands of soldiers clashed in a war that pitted Alexander's former friends directly against each other. War elephants imported from India crashed through the ranks of phalanxes. Entire armies were annihilated. By the end of this battle, Antigonus Monophthalmus, one of the most ambitious of the successors, lay dead on the field. His dream of reuniting Alexander's empire under his control ended with his body trampled into the dirt. Yet, despite the carnage, the wars of the Diadochi shaped the ancient world in profound ways. Out of the chaos emerged three major kingdoms: the Seleucid Empire in the east, the Ptolemaic Kingdom in Egypt, and the Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia. These states carried on fragments of Alexander's dream, spreading Greek culture across vast regions, a period we now call the Hellenistic Age. Cities like Alexandria in Egypt became centers of learning, trade, and power, where Greek language and philosophy blended with Egyptian, Persian, and other traditions. The world that emerged from the Diadochi Wars was not the unified empire Alexander had envisioned, but it was a world transformed by his conquest and the bloody struggles of those who fought to inherit it. Why, then, are the wars of the Diadochi so rarely remembered compared to Alexander's campaigns? Part of the reason is narrative simplicity. History tends to favor neat stories: the brilliant conqueror, the rise of an empire, the fall of a single great figure. Alexander's life fits this model perfectly, and it has inspired centuries of legends. The wars that followed, however, were messy, complicated, and fragmented. They involved too many shifting alliances and too many generals with similar names. For historians writing centuries later, it was easier to tell the story of Alexander's dazzling victories than the grinding, ugly wars that followed. Another reason lies in the politics of memory. The victors of the Diadochi Wars wanted to legitimize their rule, not remind people of the betrayals and massacres that brought them to power. The Ptolemies in Egypt presented themselves as rightful heirs of Alexander, but they had no interest in celebrating the slaughter of his family. Instead, they built monuments, libraries, and temples that projected stability and continuity. By the time Roman historians revisited these events, the wars were already fading into the background, overshadowed by Rome's own struggles for dominance. And yet, the forgotten wars of the Diadochi hold lessons that are just as important as Alexander's campaigns. They remind us that power vacuums rarely lead to peace. They show how fragile empires can be when built around the charisma of a single man. They reveal how quickly allies can turn into enemies when ambition outweighs loyalty. Most of all, they give us a glimpse into the human cost of history, the soldiers who marched and died not for a noble cause, but because powerful men could not agree on who should wear a crown. Imagine being a farmer in Anatolia or Syria at the time. Just years before, Alexander had marched through, promising liberation from Persian rule, bringing with him the glory of Greece. But in the years after his death, you would have seen city after city burned by men who claimed to be his successors. Armies would have taken your food, your sons, your home. The promise of a new world order collapsed into endless war, and no chronicler came to record your suffering. This silence, the silence of ordinary lives lost in the shadow of great men, is what makes the wars of the Diadochi one of the greatest forgotten conflicts in history. By the time the dust settled, Alexander's empire was gone forever. What remained were fractured kingdoms, each claiming to preserve his legacy, but in truth built on betrayal and blood. The world had changed, shaped not just by the brilliance of Alexander but by the wars that followed his death. These wars remind us that history is never just about the victories carved in stone or celebrated in legend. It is also about the forgotten struggles, the ones that left entire generations in ruins but never made it into the schoolbooks. In the middle of the 8th century, the Tang dynasty ruled China at the height of its golden age. Its capital, Chang'an, was the largest and most cosmopolitan city in the world, filled with poets, scholars, traders, and soldiers from every corner of Asia. The Tang court represented power, culture, and wealth on a scale unmatched anywhere else at the time. Yet beneath the glittering facade of prosperity lay deep cracks: corruption at court, rising taxes, ethnic tensions, and a military growing more powerful than the emperor himself. Into this fragile setting stepped a man named Lushan, a general of mixed Sogdian and Turkic heritage, who would ignite one of the deadliest wars in all of human history. The Lushan Rebellion, which began in 755 CE, was more than just a civil war. It was a cataclysm that tore apart the Tang dynasty and left tens of millions dead. Some estimates place the death toll as high as 30 to 36 million people, nearly 1/6 of the world's population at the time. To put that in perspective, it was deadlier than the First World War, and yet outside of China, very few people have even heard of it. The rebellion is a stark reminder of how entire civilizations can nearly collapse under the weight of internal strife, and how the memory of such devastation can fade into obscurity beyond the borders of the land it consumed. The roots of the rebellion lay in the Tang dynasty's dependence on frontier generals. To defend China's vast borders against nomadic invasions, emperors granted powerful military governors, known as judushi, wide autonomy. These generals commanded armies, collected taxes, and often ruled their regions like independent kings. One of the most successful was Lushan. Born to a Sogdian father and Turkic mother, and rose from obscurity through military talent and political cunning. By the 750s, he commanded more than 100,000 troops and had the trust of Emperor Xuanzong, who treated him almost like an adopted son. And was even a favorite at court, charming the emperor's beloved consort, Yang Guifei, who doted on him like a child. But beneath the surface, tensions grew. The Tang court was increasingly corrupt, dominated by Yang Guifei's relatives, while ordinary people groaned under the burden of taxation. The empire's prosperity rested on fragile foundations. And Lushan saw opportunity. In 755 CE, he declared himself emperor of a new dynasty and marched his armies from the northeast toward the heart of China. His forces swept down with terrifying speed, capturing the great city of Luoyang and threatening Chang'an itself. The Tang dynasty was caught unprepared. Emperor Xuanzong fled the capital in panic, abandoning his palace and court. Along the road, his own soldiers, furious at the corruption they blamed for their plight, mutinied and demanded the execution of Yang Guifei. The emperor, broken and powerless, consented. The most beloved woman in China was strangled by her guards, a tragic casualty of the rebellion's chaos. For the people of China, the war was apocalyptic. Cities were sacked, fields burned, and villages emptied as armies marched back and forth. Millions were conscripted or killed outright. Famine followed destruction, and famine brought plague. In some regions, entire populations vanished. Contemporary accounts describe corpses piled along roadsides, rivers clogged with the dead, and desperate survivors reduced to cannibalism. The grandeur of the Tang capital, with its bustling markets and endless entertainments, gave way to ashes and silence. One of the most haunting aspects of the rebellion is preserved in poetry. The Tang dynasty was a golden age of Chinese poetry, and some of its greatest poets lived through the rebellion. Du Fu, often called China's Shakespeare, recorded the suffering of ordinary people with heartbreaking clarity. He wrote of starving children, conscripts marched off to endless wars, and families shattered by violence. His verses remain as one of the few windows into the emotional devastation of the time, giving voice to the millions who otherwise would have been forgotten. Eventually, after years of chaos, the Tang dynasty managed to claw back power. And Lushan himself was assassinated by his own son in 757, but the rebellion continued under his successors. The war dragged on until 763, when Tang forces, aided by foreign allies like the Uyghurs, finally suppressed the rebels. By then, however, the damage was irreversible. The Tang dynasty survived in name, but it was fatally weakened. Never again would it wield the same unchallenged authority or brilliance. The rebellion had broken the back of China's golden age. Why, then, is the Lushan rebellion so little known outside of China, despite its staggering death toll? One reason is the Eurocentric focus of much global history writing. Western historians tended to emphasize events closer to Europe, the fall of Rome, the Crusades, the Black Death, while the catastrophes of Asia remained distant and often ignored. Another reason lies in the rebellion's complexity. Unlike the Mongol invasions or the First World War, it was not a neat story with clear villains and outcomes. It was a messy civil war, with constantly shifting allegiances, betrayals, and regional conflicts. Yet for the Chinese people, its memory endured in subtle ways. It entered folklore, poetry, and even language. Generations grew up haunted by the sense that prosperity could collapse overnight, that golden ages were fragile, and that corruption at the top could bring ruin to millions. In this way, the rebellion shaped Chinese political thought for centuries, instilling deep caution about unchecked generals, palace corruption, and the dangers of ignoring the suffering of the common people. For the ordinary men and women who lived through it, there was no larger meaning, no historical narrative to cling to, only survival. Imagine being a farmer near Luoyang as Lushan's army swept through. One day you might be paying taxes to the Tang dynasty, the next, forced to swear allegiance to An's new empire. Your crop seized, your family scattered, your village burned, and yet you had no choice but to endure. No chronicler would come to write your story. Only fragments, like Du Fu's sorrowful poems, remain to remind us of what was lost. The Inlushan rebellion deserves to be remembered not only for its scale of death but for what it reveals about the fragility of even the greatest civilizations. At the height of its power, the Tang dynasty seemed eternal. Its armies stretched across Asia, its culture dazzled the world, its cities thrived. And yet, within a few short years, internal weakness and one man's ambition brought it to the brink of collapse. The lesson is as relevant today as it was then: no empire, no matter how powerful, is immune to self-destruction. It is striking that while schoolchildren in the West learn of the Black Death, which killed perhaps 25 million in Europe, very few ever hear of the Inlushan rebellion, which may have killed even more. This silence is itself a kind of historical amnesia, a reminder that the history we inherit is selective, shaped by geography, politics, and the choices of historians long gone. But just because a war is forgotten in one part of the world does not mean its victims were any less real. Their voices still echo through the poems, ruins, and collective memory of China, whispering of a time when the world itself seemed to end. In the mid-19th century, China was a nation in turmoil. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled for centuries, was weakening under internal corruption, economic strain, and the pressures of foreign imperialism. Amid this chaos emerged a man who claimed he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ and that he had been sent to establish a new heavenly kingdom on earth. His name was Hong Xiuquan, and the movement he led would become the Taiping Rebellion, a war so vast, so bloody, and so transformative that it remains one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, yet it is almost completely unknown outside China. Hong Xiuquan was not born into privilege. He failed the imperial exams multiple times and faced social rejection. However, after a series of visions, he became convinced of his divine mission. He recruited followers, promising a radical reordering of society, equality among men and women, communal ownership of property, the abolition of private wealth, and a strict moral code forbidding opium, alcohol, and gambling. His ideology blended Christian beliefs with Chinese traditions, creating a doctrine that inspired thousands to rise up against the Qing dynasty. By 1850, what began as a local uprising in Guangxi province rapidly expanded into a full-scale civil war. Peasants, miners, and disenfranchised workers flocked to Hong's banner, forming an army that would eventually number in the millions. Their goal was to overthrow the Qing dynasty and establish the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, with its capital in Nanjing. What makes this rebellion extraordinary is not only its scale, 20 to 30 million people would die, but also its radical social experimentation. In areas under Taiping control, land was redistributed, traditional family structures were upended, and women were allowed to fight as soldiers, an unheard-of practice in 19th-century China. The Taiping Rebellion was a war of both ideology and violence. Cities that resisted were often destroyed, and civilian populations suffered immense hardships. Unlike conventional warfare, the Taiping armies enforced strict discipline among their own ranks, but their campaigns left entire regions devastated. The Qing dynasty, threatened by this revolutionary force, mobilized every resource to suppress the rebels. Foreign powers, including Britain and France, became involved, providing limited military support to the Qing in exchange for trade privileges, turning China into a battlefield not just of ideology, but of competing global interests. One of the most striking aspects of the Taiping Rebellion was its scale of organization. Hong Xiuquan and his generals implemented a rigid military hierarchy, but also attempted to enforce moral and social codes. Men and women were segregated, arranged into separate battalions, and forced to adhere to strict rules of conduct. Religious zeal was fused with revolutionary fervor, creating a sense of invincibility among the Taiping forces. At its height, the Taiping army controlled large swaths of southern China, effectively functioning as a parallel state challenging the centuries-old Qing dynasty. Despite their early successes, the Taiping forces faced enormous challenges. Factionalism emerged within their own leadership, and military strategies often failed against well-armed Qing armies. The rebellion dragged on for over a decade, marked by devastating sieges and battles that left entire cities in ruins. Nanjing, the capital of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, fell in 1864 after a prolonged siege, resulting in a massacre that wiped out nearly the entire population of the city. Families were destroyed, homes burned, and survivors scattered across the countryside. The human cost was staggering, millions perished, and countless more suffered famine, displacement, and disease. The rebellion's legacy is complex. On one hand, it highlighted the vulnerability of the Qing dynasty and exposed the deep social and economic inequalities in Chinese society. On the other, it demonstrated the power of radical religious and ideological movements to mobilize massive populations, for better or worse. Foreign observers at the time were shocked by the scale of the violence and the radical social reforms attempted by the Taiping leadership. Yet, outside of China, these events are rarely discussed, overshadowed by contemporary conflicts in Europe or the American Civil War. For ordinary people living through the rebellion, life was a daily struggle. Peasants who joined the Taiping cause sought liberation from oppressive landlords and corrupt officials, but soon found themselves caught between warring armies. Villages were burned if they failed to contribute to military efforts, and civilians were often conscripted or executed. Letters and memoirs from survivors paint a picture of a world turned upside down. Neighbors killed neighbors, cities emptied, and famine stalked the land like a second army. Even today, the scale of suffering remains difficult to comprehend. The Taiping Rebellion also left a lasting cultural imprint. It inspired future revolutionary movements in China, including the 1911 revolution that would overthrow the Qing dynasty entirely. It also forced the Qing government to modernize parts of its military and administration in response to the unprecedented challenge. Despite these profound effects, the rebellion remains a largely hidden chapter in world history, largely unknown to those outside academic circles. Why was it forgotten on a global scale? Part of the answer lies in Eurocentrism. The Western world has historically focused more on European and American conflicts, treating Asian upheavals as distant or marginal. Another factor is political. The Qing dynasty survived and controlled the narrative, emphasizing their eventual victory and minimizing the scope of the Taiping challenge. In this way, the rebellion was quietly buried in history, its scale and human suffering obscured by time and selective memory. Yet the Taiping Rebellion offers crucial lessons about power, ideology, and human resilience. It reveals how a deeply unequal society, combined with charismatic leadership and ideological fervor, can erupt into a conflict that reshapes nations. It shows the terrifying cost of civil war and the fragility of even long-standing dynasties. Most importantly, it reminds us that history often overlooks the struggles of the many in favor of the stories of a few. Millions of lives were lost, but their suffering persists in historical memory, if one knows where to look. Imagine being a child during this time, walking through burned villages, seeing neighbors and family members taken by armies, witnessing the collapse of your world. The rebellion wasn't just a political event, it was the undoing of everyday life across millions of square miles. The voices of those who endured it, recorded in fragments of poetry, letters, and official records, remind us that history is more than dates and battles, it is the lived experience of human beings caught in forces far greater than themselves. The Taiping Rebellion, like the wars of the Diadochi and the Lushan Rebellion before it, challenges our understanding of history. It asks us to look beyond celebrated victories and famous leaders to see the vast, often hidden human cost of conflict. It forces us to confront the forgotten catastrophes that shaped civilizations, altered societies, and changed the course of human history in ways textbooks rarely acknowledge. By remembering these hidden wars, we honor those who lived and died in their shadow, and we gain a clearer, more honest picture of the past. In the late 15th century, England was torn apart by a series of dynastic conflicts known as the War of the Roses. Unlike the sweeping global wars of Asia or the massive rebellions within China, this war was a domestic nightmare, a bitter struggle for the English throne between two branches of the same royal family, the House of Lancaster, symbolized by a red rose, and the House of York, represented by a white rose. Today, the conflict is often romanticized in literature and dramatized in Shakespearean plays, but the reality was far darker, brutal, chaotic, and devastating for ordinary people caught in the crossfire. The origins of the war were rooted in weak kingship, disputed succession, and simmering noble rivalries. Henry VI, the Lancastrian king, was mentally unstable and incapable of strong governance. His indecision and susceptibility to manipulation left a power vacuum that the ambitious Yorkists were eager to exploit. The country was divided, nobles took sides, and alliances shifted like quicksand. England's social and political structures, already fragile from earlier conflicts like the 100 Years' War, were ill-prepared for the prolonged instability that would follow. The war was marked by constant cycles of battle, betrayal, and shifting power. The first major confrontation occurred at St. Albans in 1455, a skirmish that set the tone for decades of intermittent fighting. Armies composed of professional soldiers, retainers, and conscripted peasants clashed repeatedly across the countryside. Castles and towns changed hands, often several times, leaving destruction and despair in their wake. Unlike large-scale conquests in foreign lands, this was a war fought in the backyards of ordinary citizens, where neighbors were forced to pick sides or flee. The brutality of the War of the Roses extended far beyond the battlefield. Political assassinations were common. Key figures, including the Duke of Suffolk and later Henry VI's supporters, were executed, often in public, to intimidate rivals. Families loyal to one side were punished, estates seized, and lands redistributed to reward victors. The consequences for peasants were even more harrowing. Conscription, taxation, and the threat of violence were everyday realities. Fields lay untended, crops rotted, and famine occasionally followed in the wake of armies moving through the land. Villages could be pillaged multiple times as the war ebbed and flowed, creating a cycle of terror and economic devastation. One of the most infamous moments came with the Battle of Towton in 1461, which is considered one of the bloodiest battles on English soil. Estimates suggest that as many as 28,000 men died in a single day. The battlefield was a scene of unimaginable carnage, with snow turning red from blood, horses trampling fallen soldiers, and survivors left to contend with the bodies of friends, foes, and strangers alike. This battle, like many others, illustrates the contrast between the polished stories of kings and the grim reality for those living through the chaos. Despite the immense suffering, the war was not fought solely by nobles and knights. Ordinary people were deeply affected, conscripted into militias or forced to provide supplies to passing armies. Many lost their livelihoods, homes, and even their families. The civilian population endured the brunt of the war's cruelty, and their stories are largely absent from the chronicles of kings and generals. What remains are glimpses through court records, letters, and accounts from townspeople who survived, offering a haunting perspective on the human cost of dynastic ambition. The war was also notable for its political intrigue and betrayal. Nobles frequently switched allegiances depending on who seemed likely to win, creating an environment of constant suspicion and paranoia. The Lancastrians and Yorkists alike used marriage, assassination, and bribery as tools to secure advantage. Even within families, loyalty was fragile. Siblings and cousins could be enemies overnight if political fortunes shifted. The complexity and duplicity of these alliances make the war difficult to fully understand, which partly explains why it is often overshadowed in history by the more straightforward narratives of kings and battles. Eventually, the conflict culminated in the rise of the Tudor dynasty. Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant, defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, effectively ending the war. Richard's death marked not only the fall of the House of York but also the beginning of a new era in English politics. The Tudors carefully cultivated their image as bringers of stability, emphasizing the end of civil strife while downplaying the decades of bloodshed that had preceded them. Monuments, portraits, and literature presented a sanitized version of history that largely erased the suffering of ordinary people. Yet, the War of the Roses left a lasting mark on England. The nobility was weakened, the monarchy became more centralized, and social structures adjusted to survive the chaos. More subtly, the war demonstrated the devastating consequences of political instability and the human cost of dynastic ambition. Ordinary citizens who lived through this period experienced trauma on a scale that rarely makes it into popular history books, but their endurance shaped the future of England in ways that echoes even today. Looking back, the War of the Roses serves as a stark reminder that history is rarely as neat as stories suggest. While Shakespeare and popular culture highlight intrigue, romance, and drama, the reality was one of terror, death, and societal collapse. Villages burned, peasants starved, and families were torn apart by a struggle for a throne that, to most, was irrelevant to their daily lives. The war exemplifies the hidden cost of power, showing how political conflicts among elites ripple outward, devastating the lives of millions who have no voice in the annals of history. In remembering the War of the Roses, we are reminded that history is not only the story of kings and generals, but also the untold stories of those who suffered in silence. Blood-soaked fields, abandoned homes, and scattered families are as much a part of the past as coronations and royal decrees. By examining these overlooked aspects, we gain a deeper, more human understanding of the past, an understanding that reveals the brutality behind the throne and the forgotten struggles of ordinary people in a war that reshaped England forever. When most people hear the word Crusades, their minds immediately jump to knights in shining armor, the Holy Land, and the dramatic battles for Jerusalem. Yet the reality is far broader, and far darker, than the familiar stories told in textbooks. Beyond the well-known campaigns to capture or defend Jerusalem, a series of lesser-known crusades swept across Europe and its peripheries. These forgotten crusades were not just religious wars, they were campaigns of conquest, forced conversion, and mass violence that targeted communities often entirely overlooked by history. From the forests of the Baltic to the hills of southern France, these crusades reshaped entire regions, leaving scars that endure even today. One of the most striking examples is the Northern Crusades, which took place between the 12th and 14th centuries. Unlike the Holy Land campaigns, these wars were directed against pagan populations in the Baltic region, modern-day Estonia, Latvia, and parts of Finland. The goal was to convert the local peoples to Christianity, but in practice, the Crusaders often resorted to systematic massacres, enslavement, and the destruction of entire communities. Cities and villages were razed, and those who resisted were often killed or sold into slavery. While the stories of Richard the Lionheart or Saladin dominate the Western imagination, the suffering of the Baltic pagans was largely erased from historical memory. The Albigensian Crusade in southern France presents another shocking example. In 1209, Pope Innocent III launched a campaign against the Cathars, a Christian sect deemed heretical. What followed was not a mere religious correction but a brutal campaign of extermination. Entire towns were destroyed, including Béziers, where chroniclers reported that tens of thousands of men, women, and children were slaughtered indiscriminately. The phrase, "kill them all, God will know his own," is said to have been spoken by a Crusader commander, highlighting the utter disregard for human life in these so-called holy wars. Wealthy lands were seized, and local populations were terrorized into submission. Over time, the Cathars were effectively wiped out, their culture and teachings largely forgotten, leaving the region scarred both physically and culturally. In Eastern Europe, the Teutonic Knights waged their own crusades against the Lithuanians and Prussians. Unlike the well-documented campaigns of the Holy Land, these wars were less about romantic ideals and more about territorial expansion and control. Castles were built as instruments of domination, and indigenous communities were forced to convert or face annihilation. The legacy of these campaigns is still visible today in place names, fortified ruins, and historical boundaries, but their human cost, tens of thousands of lives lost, is rarely acknowledged in mainstream histories. The scale and brutality of these forgotten crusades were staggering. Unlike the linear narratives of European kings or Holy Land battles, these conflicts were messy, protracted, and often characterized by terror against civilian populations. Farmers, artisans, and children were swept up in campaigns they could not influence. Villages were burned, food stores looted, and survivors either displaced or enslaved. The long-term impact included not just demographic loss, but cultural erasure. Languages, local traditions, and religious practices were forcibly suppressed or obliterated. Why have these crusades faded from common memory? One reason is narrative selection. Western historians and storytellers often emphasize the romance and chivalry of the Crusades in the Middle East, which fit neatly into moral or heroic frameworks. The Northern and Albigensian Crusades, by contrast, were morally ambiguous and often embarrassing to those who claimed to fight in God's name. They involved extreme violence against fellow Christians or pagans who posed little real threat to Europe's political or religious order. Remembering them fully would challenge the tidy, heroic image of the medieval crusader that history often prefers. Yet the lessons of these forgotten crusades are crucial. They remind us that religion, ideology, and ambition can be twisted into instruments of oppression. They demonstrate how ordinary people, farmers, artisans, women, and children, can bear the heaviest burden of wars waged in the name of distant authorities or divine will. Entire regions of Europe were reshaped by these campaigns, leaving legacies of fear, trauma, and cultural suppression that lasted for generations. For example, consider a peasant in a small Cathar village in Languedoc. One day, life might continue as usual, harvesting crops, tending livestock, praying in the local church. The next, a crusader army arrives, demanding allegiance or extermination. Families are slaughtered, homes burned, and children carried away. Survivors flee to neighboring regions, never to return. The collective trauma of these events was immense, yet for centuries, it remained overshadowed by more glorious campaigns that fit neatly into Western narratives of history. The Forgotten Crusades also offer insight into the mechanisms of historical erasure. Victors often control memory, deciding which events are celebrated and which are suppressed. The Northern Crusades were framed as noble missions of conversion, while the Albigensian campaign was sanitized in official chronicles to emphasize papal authority rather than the human suffering involved. Through selective record-keeping, the stories of countless victims were marginalized, leaving only fragments in the historical record. Despite this erasure, traces of these forgotten wars remain. Archaeological sites, ruined fortresses, and cultural remnants hint at the scale of violence and conquest. Folk tales, oral histories, and local traditions preserve the memory of resistance and survival. In these hidden records, historians can reconstruct the lives of those affected, offering a more complete, though often disturbing, picture of medieval Europe. The Forgotten Crusades challenge our perception of history. They expose the dark underbelly of ideological warfare and force us to confront uncomfortable truths, that war is rarely noble for those who live through it, and that much of what we remember is shaped by those who emerged victorious. By examining these campaigns, we gain insight into both the cruelty of the past and the fragility of human societies when ideology, power, and violence intersect. Ultimately, the Forgotten Crusades remind us that history is not only the story of kings and knights, but also of ordinary people whose lives were swept away in the tides of ambition and faith. Their suffering, largely absent from mainstream narratives, is as real and significant as any celebrated battle in history. Remembering them allows us to reclaim a part of history long hidden in the shadows, giving voice to the countless lives lost in wars that were never truly written in history books. In the early 16th century, Europe was a continent on the brink of massive social, religious, and political change. The invention of the printing press had begun to spread new ideas, the Renaissance was challenging old authorities, and the seeds of the Protestant Reformation were taking root. Amid this turbulence, ordinary people, peasants, craftsmen, and farmers, began to question the centuries-old structures that oppressed them. Their grievances, often dismissed in historical records, erupted into one of the largest and bloodiest uprisings of the period, the German Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525. Despite its scale and the millions it affected, this conflict is rarely remembered outside of academic circles, overshadowed by the sweeping narratives of kings, nobles, and religious reformers. The roots of the Peasants' War were deeply economic and social. Feudal obligations had grown heavier over centuries, as peasants were forced to give up more of their crops, labor, and rights to lords and clergy. Many communities were burdened by local taxes, unfair tithes, and arbitrary demands for military service. Beyond material hardship, the new religious ideas of Martin Luther and other reformers fueled the desire for justice. Peasants began to interpret these teachings as a call for social equality, believing that faith should empower them, not just serve the elite. This combination of economic strain and ideological inspiration ignited a movement that would sweep across the Holy Roman Empire. The war itself was a patchwork of revolts, not a single coordinated campaign. Thousands of peasants took up arms, forming militias and marching against local lords and castles. They drafted manifestos, known as the 12 Articles, demanding fair taxation, the abolition of serfdom, and the right to elect local clergy. These documents were remarkable for their clarity, ambition, and the sense that ordinary people were asserting a moral and legal claim to justice. For the first time, the oppressed spoke not only of survival but of rights, equality, and a vision of a fairer society. Yet, despite their courage, the peasants were poorly equipped for sustained warfare. Their armies, often composed of farmers armed with pitchforks, scythes, and simple swords, faced heavily trained knights and mercenaries. While their numbers were impressive, some estimates suggest hundreds of thousands participated, they lacked centralized leadership and modern tactics. Battles were often chaotic and brutal. Villages that resisted were burned, homes looted, and entire communities destroyed. The peasants' initial victories were fleeting, they could win small skirmishes, but larger confrontations with noble forces invariably ended in disaster. The suppression of the Peasants' War was merciless. The Swabian League and other noble forces crushed the revolts with overwhelming force. At the Battle of Frankenhausen in 1525, thousands of peasants were slaughtered in a single day, their bodies left to rot on the fields. Leaders were executed, rebels tortured, and surviving participants returned to lives of subjugation under stricter control. The rebellion, which began with ideals of justice and equality, ended in catastrophe, leaving a profound legacy of fear and caution among the peasantry. The human cost of the war was immense. Estimates suggest that between 100,000 and 300,000 peasants perished across the Holy Roman Empire. Beyond the statistics, entire communities were torn apart. Families were separated or wiped out, and the social fabric of rural Europe was irrevocably altered. Yet, despite this scale, the Peasants' War is often glossed over in mainstream historical accounts. European history tends to celebrate kings, generals, and religious reformers, while the suffering and agency of ordinary people are marginalized. The conflict also revealed deep tensions between emerging religious movements and social justice. Martin Luther, whose ideas helped inspire the peasants' sense of moral righteousness, ultimately condemned the revolts. He urged the peasants to submit to their rulers, fearing social chaos more than injustice. This stance alienated many supporters of reform and highlighted the complex relationship between ideology and practical power. It also demonstrates how history can be shaped not only by events but by the interpretation and biases of those in positions of influence. For the ordinary peasant living through this time, daily life was a constant struggle. Imagine a farmer in Swabia, trying to harvest crops while fearing sudden raids from mercenary armies or punitive noble forces. Communities that once relied on mutual aid and local traditions suddenly faced violence from both sides of the conflict. Children went hungry, villages were destroyed, and families lived in constant fear. The peasants' revolt was not a romantic struggle, it was a desperate, bloody fight for survival, dignity, and the hope of a better future. Despite its failure, the Peasants' War left a lasting impact on European society. It demonstrated the potential power of ordinary people to challenge entrenched authority. It also forced rulers to reconsider policies of governance and control, knowing that widespread unrest could erupt when grievances were ignored. The war planted the seeds of later social reforms and revolutions, even if those changes would take centuries to materialize. The German Peasants' War, like the Forgotten Crusades or the Lushan Rebellion, is a story of ambition, oppression, and human resilience that remains largely hidden from popular history. It challenges the notion that history belongs only to kings and generals, reminding us that millions of lives, struggles, and deaths were part of the shaping of the world. By examining this forgotten conflict, we gain insight into the recurring patterns of injustice and resistance that define human history, and the enormous, often overlooked, cost borne by those who dare to fight for change. Ultimately, the Peasants' War is a testament to the power, and peril, of the oppressed rising against entrenched systems. It reminds us that history is as much about the hidden struggles of ordinary people as it is about the celebrated deeds of rulers, and that the forgotten revolts of the past continue to echo in the moral and social consciousness of the world today. In the latter half of the 19th century, a devastating war raged across the heart of South America, yet it remains almost unknown in global history books. The War of the Triple Alliance, fought from 1864 to 1870, pitted Paraguay against a coalition of Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. While Europe and North America were preoccupied with their own conflicts, the American Civil War had just ended, and European nations were embroiled in imperial expansion. The people of Paraguay faced a war that would nearly annihilate their nation. The scale of the tragedy, its human cost, and the complete transformation of Paraguay make this conflict one of the most catastrophic wars in modern history, yet it remains largely hidden outside South America. The origins of the war were rooted in political ambition, territorial disputes, and personal rivalries. Paraguay, under the leadership of President Francisco Solano López, had grown into a relatively stable and independent nation in a region dominated by larger neighbors. López was ambitious and increasingly authoritarian, seeking to expand Paraguay's influence in the region and protect it from perceived threats by Brazil and Argentina. When conflicts erupted in neighboring Uruguay, López intervened militarily, seeing it as an opportunity to assert Paraguay's power. What began as a regional intervention quickly escalated into a full-scale war against the Triple Alliance. Paraguay was small and isolated compared to its opponents, yet López mobilized his nation with extraordinary determination. Men were conscripted en masse, women supported the war effort by working in factories and hospitals, and the government took extraordinary measures to prepare the country for total conflict. Paraguay's army, although outnumbered, initially fought with remarkable skill and tenacity, winning early victories that surprised the larger coalition forces. Yet the sheer imbalance of resources, manpower, and logistics meant that Paraguay's resistance could not last indefinitely. The war was catastrophic for the civilian population. López's conscription policies meant that almost every able-bodied male was drafted, leaving the countryside virtually defenseless. Entire communities were uprooted, crops destroyed, and cities burned during the repeated invasions by coalition forces. Starvation and disease became rampant as the war dragged on, claiming more lives than the battles themselves. Some estimates suggest that Paraguay lost up to 70% of its male population, a staggering demographic collapse that reshaped the country for generations. Families were torn apart, villages disappeared, and survivors struggled to rebuild amid the ruins of a once thriving nation. One of the most haunting aspects of the war was López's unyielding leadership. Even as defeat became inevitable, he refused to surrender, insisting on total resistance. Battles such as Tuyuti and Curupati were marked by extraordinary carnage, with tens of thousands of soldiers killed in single engagements. López's final stand in Cerro Cora in 1870 ended in his death and the symbolic destruction of Paraguay's military leadership. By the war's conclusion, the nation was left in ruins, economically devastated, politically destabilized, and socially fractured. The scale of the human suffering is almost incomprehensible. Paraguay, a country of fewer than 1 million people at the time, lost the vast majority of its male population. Generations were affected, leaving women and children to rebuild a shattered society. Diseases such as cholera and dysentery spread unchecked, compounded by famine caused by destroyed farmland. Survivors faced a lifetime of trauma, with many villages depopulated and infrastructure destroyed. The social and cultural scars of the war are still visible today, yet in much of the world, the tragedy remains a footnote, eclipsed by European and North American conflicts of the same era. Why has this war been forgotten globally? Part of the answer lies in geography and Eurocentric historical focus. While Europe and the United States dominate mainstream history education, the stories of South America are often marginalized. Another factor is political. The post-war narrative in Paraguay was one of national rebuilding, emphasizing resilience rather than dwelling on the extraordinary scale of death and devastation. Neighboring countries, having achieved victory, also framed the war in ways that justified their actions while minimizing the scale of the human tragedy. The War of the Triple Alliance also demonstrates how ambition, nationalism, and miscalculation can lead to disaster. López's desire to assert Paraguay's independence collided with the overwhelming military and economic power of the coalition, leading to a total catastrophe. It highlights the fragility of small nations in the face of larger powers and the devastating consequences when diplomacy fails and war takes over. The conflict is a stark reminder that wars often produce hidden catastrophes whose scale is not reflected in conventional historical narratives. For ordinary Paraguayans, the war meant unimaginable loss. Fathers, sons, and brothers were conscripted, killed, or permanently disabled. Women were left to manage farms, care for children, and maintain communities under extreme duress. Survivors had to contend with destroyed infrastructure, disease, famine, and the psychological trauma of losing nearly half of their population. Entire communities vanished, and the demographic shock reshaped Paraguayan society for decades. Despite its near erasure from global history, the War of the Triple Alliance profoundly shaped Paraguay's identity. The country's small size, cautious foreign policy, and strong sense of national unity can all be traced back to this traumatic experience. Monuments and memorials in Paraguay honor those who died, and scholars continue to study the war's impact on social structure, economy, and culture. Yet for much of the world, this war remains an obscure chapter, hidden behind the shadow of more famous conflicts, demonstrating how history often overlooks the greatest suffering simply because it falls outside dominant narratives. Ultimately, the War of the Triple Alliance reminds us that history is not only defined by battles and treaties but by the lived experiences of millions who suffer in silence. It is a story of ambition, miscalculation, and unimaginable human cost, a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating the fragility of nations and the devastating consequences of war. By remembering Paraguay's hidden catastrophe, we honor those who endured and challenged the selective memory that often dominates world history, showing that some of the deadliest wars are those least remembered. Central Africa, with its dense jungles, vast rivers, and abundant natural resources, has long been both a blessing and a curse. The Congo, in particular, has experienced waves of violence and exploitation that have largely escaped global attention. From the late 19th century to the present day, the region has been the site of brutal conflicts driven by colonial ambitions, resource extraction, and ethnic rivalries. These wars, forgotten by much of the world, have claimed millions of lives and left scars on the population that persist today, highlighting a pattern of hidden human suffering in the shadow of global indifference. The first major wave of violence in the Congo occurred under King Leopold II of Belgium. At the end of the 19th century, Leopold claimed the Congo Free State as his personal possession, rather than a colony of Belgium. This so-called civilizing mission quickly turned into a nightmare for the local population. Villagers were forced to harvest rubber and ivory under inhumane conditions, and failure to meet quotas was met with horrific punishments, mutilation, flogging, and execution. Historians estimate that between 10 and 15 million Congolese died during this period, a staggering loss for a population of fewer than 20 million. Yet for decades, the atrocities were largely ignored outside Europe, hidden beneath the veneer of colonial propaganda and economic ambition. The 20th century did little to bring peace. After the Congo gained independence in 1960, the newly formed nation was immediately plunged into chaos. Patrice Lumumba, the charismatic first prime minister, was assassinated within months, a victim of both internal rivalries and international interference. The country fractured as local militias, backed by foreign powers, fought for control of its rich mineral resources. Copper, cobalt, gold, and diamonds became both the prize and the curse, fueling conflicts that were both politically and economically motivated. Millions more died from violence, starvation, and disease during this period, yet much of the world remained unaware, distracted by Cold War politics elsewhere. Perhaps the most notorious modern conflict in the Congo is the Second Congo War, 1998 to 2003, sometimes called Africa's World War because it drew in armies from 9 African nations and dozens of militias. Fighting was widespread, with atrocities committed against civilians on a massive scale. Massacres, sexual violence, forced labor, and the recruitment of child soldiers were tragically common. Unlike conventional warfare, where battlefronts are clear, these wars were dispersed and decentralized, making them harder to report on and easier for the international community to ignore. Estimates of the death toll vary, but researchers suggest that over 5 million people died directly or indirectly from the war's effects. The human cost of these conflicts cannot be overstated. Imagine living in a Congolese village during the late 1990s. Armed groups might arrive at any time, demanding food, recruits, or valuables. Families lived in constant fear, unable to farm, gather water, or send children to school. Women were particularly vulnerable, often subjected to sexual violence used as a weapon of war. Men were killed, abducted, or forced to fight. Disease and starvation, compounded by the destruction of infrastructure, claimed far more lives than bullets alone. This is a pattern that has repeated across decades, hidden, protracted violence that devastates entire communities. Resource exploitation has been both a cause and consequence of the Congo's hidden wars. Diamonds, gold, and coltan, used in electronics, have funded militias and foreign corporations alike. These conflict minerals turn ordinary villages into battlefields, as groups vie for control over the wealth beneath the soil. The suffering of local populations, caught in cycles of extraction and violence, is rarely reflected in global discussions about economics or technology. The Congo's riches, instead of bringing prosperity, have repeatedly brought death and instability. Why have the Congo's wars been forgotten? One reason is distance. Western media and historical narratives often focus on conflicts closer to Europe or the United States. Another is complexity. These wars involve multiple factions, foreign interventions, and a mix of political, ethnic, and economic motivations, making them difficult to condense into simple stories. Yet perhaps the most tragic reason is indifference. For much of the world, the suffering of African populations has been invisible, deemed less urgent or dramatic than conflicts in wealthier regions. This silence compounds the tragedy, leaving victims without voice and perpetrators without accountability. Despite the devastation, the Congolese people have shown extraordinary resilience. Survivors rebuild communities, document atrocities, and advocate for justice despite immense obstacles. International organizations, human rights groups, and some journalists have brought attention to parts of the crisis, but the full scale of suffering remains underrepresented in history books and global consciousness. The lessons of the Congo's hidden wars are stark: unchecked exploitation, foreign interference, and the absence of effective governance can combine to produce catastrophes on a scale that is almost unimaginable. The forgotten wars of the Congo also underscore the importance of perspective in history. While textbooks often emphasize European battles, world wars, or revolutions, the Congo reminds us that some of the deadliest, most transformative conflicts occur far from the spotlight. Millions of lives, lost, traumatized, or uprooted, deserve recognition. Their stories, though difficult to tell, reveal patterns of greed, power, and human suffering that repeat across centuries and continents. Ultimately, the Congo's hidden wars force us to confront uncomfortable truths about history, that violence is not always remembered equally, that wealth often brings exploitation, and that ordinary people are frequently the silent victims of global ambitions. By studying and acknowledging these conflicts, we can expand our understanding of history beyond Europe and North America, bringing attention to those whose lives were forever altered by wars that the world has largely forgotten. The Congo's story is one of tragedy, resilience, and the unflinching human cost of hidden conflicts, a reminder that some of the deadliest wars are those we never hear about. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, it was framed in global headlines as a battle between North and South, a proxy for the emerging Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Yet beneath the well-known narratives of armies, tanks, and international diplomacy lay a series of hidden atrocities that remain largely unacknowledged outside Korea. Civilians, men, women, and children, bore the brunt of the violence, with countless massacres, forced displacements, and systematic killings that paint a darker picture of a war often remembered for battles and political maneuvering rather than its human toll. The roots of these hidden massacres lay in political suspicion and military paranoia. As North Korean forces advanced south in June 1950, and then as UN and South Korean forces pushed back, both sides became obsessed with rooting out suspected collaborators. Entire villages were accused of supporting the enemy, often without evidence. Those accused faced immediate execution, and many communities were collectively punished. Estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed in such purges during the early years of the war. Entire towns disappeared from maps, their populations massacred or forced to flee, leaving ghostly remnants of once thriving communities. One of the most infamous examples is the No-Gun-Ri massacre, which occurred in late July 1950. South Korean refugees, including hundreds of women and children, were trapped under U.S. military suspicion of being enemy infiltrators. Soldiers opened fire from above and from machine guns, killing an estimated 200 to 400 civilians. Eyewitness accounts describe families huddling under bridges, only to be strafed repeatedly, their cries echoing through the riverbed. The incident was covered up for decades, only coming to international attention in the late 1990s, highlighting the deliberate erasure of civilian suffering from public consciousness. Other massacres occurred across both the North and South. In areas controlled by North Korean forces, suspected anti-communist civilians were executed en masse, often buried in mass graves. Similarly, South Korean forces targeted leftist sympathizers, including members of families with perceived ideological ties. The result was a climate of terror, where ordinary people were caught between warring factions and forced to navigate survival under impossible circumstances. Fear became a constant companion, as villagers never knew which side would regard them as enemies next. The human suffering extended beyond executions. Forced relocations, starvation, and disease were rampant. Villages destroyed by shelling left thousands homeless, while infrastructure collapse prevented access to food, water, and medical care. Children were orphaned, women were subjected to sexual violence, and families struggled to maintain any semblance of life amid chaos. Unlike traditional battles, these hidden massacres rarely had clearly defined fronts. They were decentralized, sporadic, and devastating precisely because they targeted civilians indiscriminately. Why have these atrocities remained hidden for so long? Political and ideological factors played a significant role. During the Cold War, Western media largely framed the conflict as a struggle against communism, emphasizing military victories and geopolitical stakes. Stories of civilian suffering, especially those caused by Allied forces, were suppressed to maintain public support. Similarly, in the North, the regime controlled information tightly, erasing evidence of internal purges and civilian killings. For decades, the voices of ordinary Koreans, the real victims, remained largely silenced, leaving history dominated by state narratives rather than human experience. The psychological toll on survivors was immense. Witnesses of massacres often carried lifelong trauma, their memories passed down as whispered warnings rather than official history. Families who lost multiple generations struggled with grief in silence, unable to publicly acknowledge or memorialize the full extent of the atrocities. In many cases, fear of political reprisal kept survivors from speaking out, ensuring that their experiences remained buried for decades. Historians today are slowly uncovering the scale of these hidden massacres through declassified documents, survivor testimonies, and forensic investigations of mass graves. These studies suggest that the civilian death toll may have reached up to 1 million, nearly a quarter of the war's total fatalities. When combined with the destruction of infrastructure, forced migrations, and widespread famine, it becomes clear that civilians bore an enormous, disproportionate burden during the Korean War, a reality largely absent from traditional war narratives. The Korean War's hidden massacres also highlight broader patterns of wartime violence. Civilians are often the silent victims, targeted not necessarily for their actions but for perceived threats, convenience, or as tools of terror. These massacres blur the line between combatants and non-combatants, challenging simplistic notions of heroism or villainy in war. They remind us that conflict is rarely confined to battlefields, its consequences ripple outward, devastating those with no stake in political ambitions. For the ordinary Korean, survival often depended on a combination of luck, ingenuity, and concealment. Families hid in forests, fled across mountains, or sought shelter in caves. Each day presented life-or-death decisions, whether to trust neighbors, whether to stay or run, and whether to comply with occupying forces. The war stripped away the safety of home, community, and routine, leaving civilians to navigate a landscape of constant fear and uncertainty. Ultimately, the hidden massacres of the Korean War compel us to reconsider how history remembers conflict. While textbooks focus on armies, generals, and treaties, the lives destroyed in silent massacres are equally central to the story of the war. By acknowledging these overlooked atrocities, we honor the millions who suffered, survived, or perished in the shadows of history. The Korean War, often framed as a proxy battle of the Cold War, is also a profound lesson in the human cost of ideological and military ambition, a lesson that echoes through every hidden war we have yet to fully recognize. In the mid-1970s, Cambodia, a country with a rich cultural heritage, thriving villages, and centuries-old traditions, was plunged into one of the darkest chapters of modern history. The rise of the Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, transformed the nation into a laboratory of ideological extremism, where millions of people were forced to abandon their homes, work under brutal conditions, or face execution. Unlike wars fought over borders or resources, this conflict was a war against an entire society, its cities, culture, and very identity. The Cambodian genocide remains one of the most horrifying yet under-discussed atrocities of the 20th century, a hidden war that destroyed a nation almost entirely. The Khmer Rouge seized power in April 1975, promising a radical utopia modeled on agrarian socialism. Pol Pot and his followers sought to eliminate all remnants of modernity, urbanization, and Western influence. Cities were emptied overnight as residents were forcibly marched into rural labor camps. Doctors, teachers, intellectuals, and even those who wore glasses were targeted as threats to the new order. The regime's ideology was absolute. Anyone deemed corrupt or disloyal had no place in their vision of a purified society. In practice, this meant systematic killings, starvation, and forced labor that became Cambodia's daily reality. The human cost was staggering. Between 1975 and 1979, an estimated 1.7 to 2 million Cambodians, roughly a quarter of the population, perished. Hunger, overwork, disease, and executions claimed lives indiscriminately. The killing fields, mass graves scattered across the countryside, became symbols of the Khmer Rouge's brutality. Villagers were forced to dig their own graves before being shot. Families were torn apart, and traditional social structures were obliterated. Children were separated from parents and indoctrinated into the regime's ideology, creating a generation raised under fear, indoctrination, and violence. What makes the Cambodian genocide particularly harrowing is its deliberate, systematic nature. This was not an unintended consequence of war, it was a planned eradication of perceived enemies and undesirable social groups. Intellectuals, religious practitioners, and ethnic minorities were singled out. Even the slightest deviation from the regime's rigid rules could result in death. Pol Pot's vision of equality was perverse, only complete submission to the state ensured survival. The Cambodian people were trapped in a nightmare where ordinary acts, reading a book, speaking a foreign language, or wearing modern clothes, could be fatal. Daily life under the Khmer Rouge was an exercise in extreme endurance. Villagers worked long hours in fields, often without adequate food, water, or shelter. Malnutrition and disease were rampant, and exhaustion became a constant companion. Survivors recount the terrifying unpredictability of violence, sudden arrests, executions for minor infractions, or the arrival of cadres who could condemn an entire village. Psychological trauma was as pervasive as physical suffering, with fear shaping every interaction, every decision, every moment of life. The regime's destruction extended beyond human life to culture and history. Temples, libraries, and schools were destroyed, erasing centuries of heritage. Art, literature, and music were banned or destroyed. Religious practices, particularly Buddhism, were outlawed, and monks were executed or forced into labor. Cambodia's cultural memory was under attack, leaving a void that took decades to recover. The genocide was not just a war against people, it was a war against identity, memory, and civilization itself. Why is the Cambodian genocide less recognized globally than other 20th-century atrocities? Partly because it occurred in a relatively small, remote country during the Cold War, overshadowed by conflicts in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and the Middle East. Political dynamics also played a role. Western governments were cautious in condemning the Khmer Rouge initially due to strategic considerations, and the remote nature of the country limited first-hand reporting. As a result, millions of lives were lost while the world largely looked elsewhere, allowing the horrors to remain hidden for years. The Khmer Rouge's fall in 1979, brought about by a Vietnamese invasion, ended the regime but did not immediately heal the wounds. Survivors returned to devastated villages, mourning lost family members, and attempting to rebuild in a landscape of ruins. Mental scars, social disruption, and lingering trauma persisted, making recovery a generational challenge. Families had to reconstruct not only homes but also relationships, community structures, and cultural continuity that had been systematically dismantled. The Cambodian genocide also serves as a stark warning about the dangers of ideology unchecked by humanity. It illustrates how totalitarian ambitions, combined with radical utopian visions, can annihilate entire populations in the name of purification or social engineering. Ordinary people, once living normal lives, were reduced to pawns in a horrifying experiment, their existence erased if they failed to conform to the regime's rigid standards. Remembering the Cambodian genocide is crucial not only for honoring the victims but for understanding the mechanisms of hidden wars. It forces us to confront the deliberate cruelty that can accompany political power and ideological obsession. By studying these events, we can recognize patterns in history, how fear, control, and dehumanization operate across conflicts and cultures, and ensure that future generations understand both the fragility and resilience of human societies in the face of extreme oppression. Ultimately, the Cambodian genocide is a chilling reminder of what can happen when power, ideology, and brutality converge. It challenges our assumptions about war, showing that the deadliest conflicts are not always fought with armies on battlefields, but in the villages, homes, and hearts of ordinary people. By uncovering and remembering this hidden war, we honor the millions of lives lost and reaffirm the importance of bearing witness to history in its full, unflinching reality. In 1967, the southeastern region of Nigeria, predominantly inhabited by the Igbo people, declared independence as the Republic of Biafra. What followed over the next 3 years was one of the most devastating and underreported wars of the 20th century. The Nigerian Civil War, or Biafran War, was not only a battle for political control but also a human catastrophe, characterized by mass starvation, widespread disease, and the near collapse of an entire society. Despite the scale of the suffering, the conflict has often been overshadowed in global consciousness by simultaneous events like the Vietnam War or the Arab-Israeli tensions. The roots of the war lay in deep ethnic, political, and economic divisions. Nigeria, having gained independence from Britain in 1960, struggled to integrate its diverse population, which included the Igbo, Hausa Fulani, and Yoruba ethnic groups, among others. Coups, massacres, and escalating tensions created an environment of mistrust and fear. When Biafra seceded, the Nigerian government responded with full military force, determined to reunify the country by any means necessary. What followed was a protracted war marked by strategic cruelty and the targeting of civilians, with starvation becoming a deliberate weapon of conflict. Biafra, cut off from most international aid, quickly faced extreme food shortages. The Nigerian government imposed a blockade, preventing supplies from reaching the region. Civilians were trapped in a nightmare of hunger and disease, with relief efforts hampered by both political and logistical obstacles. Hospitals ran out of medicine, clean water became scarce, and malnutrition spread rapidly among children and the elderly. Images of emaciated children, eyes hollow and bodies skeletal, became symbols of the war's cruelty, haunting the world and galvanizing humanitarian organizations into action. The scale of civilian suffering was unprecedented. It is estimated that between 500,000 and 2 million people died from starvation, disease, and the direct consequences of the conflict. Unlike conventional battles, these deaths were not the result of artillery or combat but of a calculated strategy to weaken resistance by depriving populations of basic necessities. Families were forced to make unimaginable choices, rationing food to keep some members alive while others perished, or sending children on dangerous journeys to seek aid. Daily survival became a gamble, with famine as relentless an enemy as any army. International attention to the crisis was limited and often politically complicated. While journalists and humanitarian organizations tried to report on the starvation, Cold War politics influenced the global response. Some nations supported the Nigerian government as a legitimate authority, while others criticized the blockade but lacked the capacity or will to intervene. Non-governmental organizations, like Médecins Sans Frontières, were created partly in response to the humanitarian disaster in Biafra, highlighting how hidden wars can catalyze global awareness of civilian suffering even decades later. The human toll extended beyond starvation. Civilians were frequently caught in crossfire during military engagements, with villages shelled and towns bombed. Refugees fled in waves, creating temporary camps that often lacked sanitation, medicine, and security. Disease spread rapidly, compounding the already catastrophic effects of famine. Malaria, cholera, and dysentery claimed countless lives, and the psychological trauma endured by survivors left deep scars that lasted generations. Children, orphaned by both hunger and conflict, grew up without parents, schools, or stability, shaping an entire generation under duress. The Biafran War also underscores the use of modern media in revealing hidden atrocities. Photographs of starving children, broadcast worldwide, shocked audiences and spurred humanitarian campaigns. Yet despite this exposure, the broader narrative often focused on geopolitical strategy and military outcomes, rather than the daily suffering of civilians. In many ways, the war exemplifies the tension between human tragedy and political narrative. The deaths of millions became a backdrop to the story of state power, national unity, and military conquest. For ordinary Biafrans, life during the war was a daily test of endurance. Mothers scavenged for food in fields or distant villages, children scavenged for scraps, and communities attempted to organize relief networks despite constant bombardment and the threat of disease. Entire regions became ghost towns, with empty homes and abandoned farms, a chilling testament to the war's destructive power. Psychological scars were widespread, with survivors recounting nightmares, trauma, and the pervasive fear of death by hunger or violence. The war ended in January 1970, when Biafra surrendered to the Nigerian government. Yet victory brought little immediate relief. Millions had perished, infrastructure was destroyed, and social cohesion was shattered. Recovery took years, as the Nigerian government faced the monumental task of reintegrating Biafrans and rebuilding communities. Memorialization of the war was complicated by political sensitivities, leaving many survivors' stories untold, their suffering underrepresented in history. The Biafran tragedy serves as a stark reminder that war is not only fought with bullets and bombs. Starvation, displacement, and disease can be as lethal as any battle, and civilians often bear the heaviest burden. It challenges conventional notions of warfare, emphasizing that hidden strategies of control, like blockades and deprivation, can leave long-lasting scars, even if they are less visible than battlefield victories. Ultimately, the Nigerian Civil War and the Biafran famine highlight the human cost of political ambition and ethnic division. Millions suffered and died, their lives erased or ignored in broader historical narratives. By examining this hidden conflict, we confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of war, that those with the least power often pay the highest price, and that the true legacy of conflict is often measured in the lost, the displaced, and the starving rather than the captured or the defeated. Remembering Biafra is essential to understanding the hidden dimensions of human suffering in war and ensuring that these stories are not lost to history.